Does it matter when you vote in Republicans? Because many would argue that the left's domination of big tech, of the media, of almost, as I mentioned earlier, every institution from the FBI downwards, means that simply when you elect these politicians, they can actually impact very little. And the other argument that some Trump supporters would say as well is that even when you're electing certain Republicans, they simply support the same system that they believe to be working, these kind of Bush-era Republicans. So do you think that there's any point in winning these elections in any case?
There has to be a point, but you've sort of outlined exactly what I wrote in the book, The Dying Citizen, in the chapter, The Unelected. I said we have 2 million people in the federal workforce and 40% of Americans work for some form of government. And we have these unelected people, an Anthony Fauci, a Mark Milley, a Lois Lerner at the IRS, a James Clapper, an Andrew McCabe, a James Comey. And they exercise judicial, executive, and legislative power on their own. And administrations and senators come and go, but they stay. And they have to be held accountable. And they lie under oath. We know that Clapper did. We knew that Comey feigned under oath 245 times he couldn't remember. Robert Mueller didn't know what the Steele dossier was, apparently, even though it was the center of his investigation, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have to hold those people accountable. And your other point is valid, that when you have the traditional blue blood, silk stocking Republican wing that's in that New York-Washington nexus, they're so integrated with the left, whether they're Supreme Court judges or whether they're senior senators or even administrations, that they feel that they have more in common culturally and socially with their counterparts than they do with their ideological allies, supposedly in the Midwest or something. So a lot of us have talked about that. How do you stop that? And one of them is, I think it seems simple, but you can break up Washington. I don't know why the FBI is in Washington. It should be in Kansas City. I don't know why the Department of Agriculture is in Washington. It should be in Fresno or Texas somewhere. And if you broke up a lot of those nexuses, especially in the age of electronic communications like Skype or Zoom, it would really help. And that I think we also really need to look at antitrust legislation, anti-monopoly legislation. When you have Google running 90% of the searches, or social media is controlled by Twitter and Facebook. So there's things that we can do if we had a Republican Party that's not compromised. And for all practical purposes, let's be frank, if you are a Republican today and you want to run for Congress and you want to run for the Senate almost anywhere, you're not going to be able to run on a John McCain, Mitt Romney agenda. And the people who tried it, like Liz Cheney, they're going to lose. She's going to lose in Wyoming, and she's from an ancient family there that has enormous influence and power and a network of supporters, and she's got a huge nationwide fundraising apparatus, and she's going to lose. And so I think that the Republican Party finally is shedding this image that it's a bunch of white guys on the golf course putting around and talking about capital gains and privatizing Social Security. And it's a party of the middle class, in contrast to the Democratic Party that despises the white working class, we know, but really the entire white working class, and is a party of very, very wealthy people, the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffetts, the Zuckerbergs, the Bloombergs, and then the subsidized lower middle class and poor. And so they don't care about the middle class. They feel they lack the romance of the poor, and they don't have the culture or the sophistication of the wealthy. And they make fun of them on 360 degrees, 24/7. These are the deplorables. I'm quoting Biden and Obama and Hillary. These are irredeemable, deplorable, and John McCain called them the crazies. So they have a whole language of disparagement for them.
It's fascinating. You're seeing these exact same trends in the United Kingdom, where
yes,
more working class voters are now voting for the Conservatives by a huge margin than voting for the Labour Party for all the same reasons. I'm curious as well, I just find their rhetoric so fascinating, those on the left, when they talk about things like, we live in an era of white supremacy, we need to end all racism. These seem to be very lofty goals. But where does this sort of end? When is white supremacy ended? When is racism ended? Where does this revolution stop?
It never ends for them.
Well, this is my question. What is their aim? I don't really understand.
I think part of it is psychological in two ways. And this is kind of a tired trope, but I do think there's something to it, that when somebody loses any sense of transcendence, that you don't believe that there's something after this world, or there's powers in this world that cannot be calibrated, that require faith, and you find you have an inner human need for that. And for the left that are atheists and agnostic, their religion is getting in your face and forcing you to be a better person, whether that's on the climate or race. And that explains the frenzy. The other thing is more, I'm not a Freudian or Jungian, but there is something to the idea that we have created, if you go to Palo Alto, California, where I work, or you go up to Woodside or Atherton or Hillsdale, or the Upper West Side in New York, or suburbs of Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Austin, Texas, the bluest of the blue places, they're almost all, Portland, the most radical city of the United States, is 96% white. So what I'm getting at is a lot of these very wealthy white people feel more comfortable with white people. And they feel terrible that they feel more comfortable. So in the abstract, they hunt out supremacy and racism and white privilege. But in the concrete, it never affects where their kids go to school, who they have over for dinner, who they associate, with the minor exception that a very elite level of minorities who they feel comfortable with, but they do not want to be with a middle class, white or non-white, and most of the non-white are middle class. So they create this constructed caring, and I've seen it so much on the Stanford campus, where I see these white kids, and if they really believed in helping minorities, they'd come down here to Fresno or Bakersfield and tutor, or they would send their kids to Cal State Fresno or Cal State Turlock. But when you look at how they live, they're the most pretentious, envious, status-conscious people in the world. And they don't want to be around anybody but themselves, and they feel terrible about it. Just look at the luminaries of the current Democratic Party. Nancy Pelosi lives in a huge home in San Francisco in a gated Napa Valley palazzo. Gated. Mark Zuckerberg has a 50,000 square foot home on Hawaii with a wall around. They hate walls. They say they don't work. Barbara Streisand, all of these people down on the PCH in Malibu, same thing. So when you look at the schools, they worship, and it's very funny. They're all talking about we need not just proportional representation for college admissions, but what they call now things like equity admission or repertory admission. So if you're African American, you're not going to be let in regardless of your credentials at 12% of the incoming Yale or Harvard or Stanford class, but maybe 15 or 18. But when you look at the numbers, and the same is true for Latinos, there's only one rubric you can cut, and that's white males, because you're 55% women anyway, and you're getting white males that are 33% of the population down to about 15. And who does that hit if they're not a legacy, you're not a multimillionaire to give the money to buy your way in? It hits the children of the white professional classes. And so what are they doing right now? And I can attest this from firsthand knowledge. They are calling up the admissions office. They are calling up a dean. They're calling up a president. My kid didn't get into Stanford or Harvard. What am I going to do? This is terrible. I didn't think diversity would do this to me. Or they're getting carjacked in Portland. Or somebody took their catalytic converter in Minneapolis. Or they can't go to downtown Seattle. I didn't think that this was going to happen to me. Or the Soros DA that they voted for let out somebody that just broke into their home. And so this was all, I don't want to say it was a game, but this was sort of revolutionary chic. And now the Frankenstein monster they created is going after them, and they don't like it. So they project all of these pathologies onto other people because they suffer them themselves.
Is America a sort of victim of its own success? After the Cold War, when you won that war, the Soviet Union collapsed, America, people were talking about the end of history. As you mentioned quite rightly, Christianity, religion has declined mostly in Western countries as we become richer. So people feel that there's no ideological enemy and that there's no God anymore that they can look to as a sort of purpose. So this kind of meaning in their life is having to be filled with very odd, radical ideologies.
I think that's pretty much sums it up. And that's was sort of the warning at the very beginning. There was a reason that Aristotle and Plato and many of the Stoics, well, we would call them conservative or right-wing, or maybe the Roman nihilists, Suetonius, Petronius, Tacitus, were kind of that way. And they all had a common, and I don't want to get into the German nihilists, but because I don't really approve of them, I don't like them, but Hegel and Nietzsche and Spengler, they all had a similar theme, that when you combine market capitalism or free markets with constitutional government, it puts an enormous onus on the citizen to not do what he's materially and legally able to do. And that what the Romans call luxus, or decadence. And so if you don't have a religious concept or a religious community or a family support network or a small town shame culture, and you've got all this money and all this freedom, human nature being what it is, there's no brakes on your appetites. So here we are, when the very economic fabric, the agricultural fabric, the energy fabric, the foreign policy are all stressed out. But when you look at the upper middle classes and the wealthy, what are they doing? And you look at the popular culture magazines and blogs, they're enjoying a level of indulgence. It's just, whether it's John Kerry flying all over the world in his private jet to combat climate change, or, Mark Zuckerberg's latest acquisition, or Bill Gates buying 200,000 acres. It reminds me of Trimalchio and Petronius the Satyricon. So that was always a fear of what this West, and when you mentioned the UK, there was no reason why it would be different than ours, or we'd be different than the UK, because you have the same ingredients at work. A very sophisticated and stable form of government, and a free market, even under your socialism, a free market economy, and a lot of people who are getting very wealthy, and they're very free, and they don't believe in anything more than themselves. And they're indulgent, and they're at war with less well-off people in the interior and the hinterland that are more traditional. And they despise those people. It doesn't go the other way. The traditionalists in the West doesn't really hate this coastal globalist elite. They just feel that they're misled, and they don't want to be around them. That elite hates the interior and wakes up every morning saying, what did I do to curb those people? And then they go to bed saying, I don't do enough. So they're incessant.